Hey, my friend. So, Bitfarms released their March 2025, operational update, and I do think that it's actually a very positive update in many ways. However, that's overshadowed by the fact that the stock price, despite being up a couple pennies today, is still well under $1 a share. And, from some of the comments I'm reading on X, as well as to some of my broadcasts on YouTube, there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of anger. I think there's just a lot of just overall, this kind of sense of like, man, what the heck are we doing as a company, right? So on the topic of what Bitfarms is doing as a company, why don't we just dive into some of the numbers that were released today with regard to the March 2025 update, production update. Listen, I'm going to just keep it high-level overview because there's only a couple of numbers that I think ultimately matter. So as we both know, right, Bitfarms has been aiming to achieve 21 exahash of operational Bitcoin mining, hash rate. And so the company is actually slowly but surely, steadily moving closer and closer to that goal. So in March, the operational hash rate actually surpassed 19 exahash, which actually is pretty darn good. It's 19.5. So at this point, we're really closing in on 20 exahash. 21 exahash isn't that far behind. As a brief reminder, what I believe, and I'm paraphrasing, what I believe Ben mentioned was sort of keeping Bitfarms from sort of closing that gap completely, was some of these miners that needed some maintenance issues, right, to be handled with them. Once they come back online, hey, the hash rate's going to move up. And I do believe there were something roughly here around maybe like 4,000 or so miners that needed to be replaced entirely, not because of some malfunction issue, but just because, it was time for them to be upgraded. So once all of those things are in place, I do suspect we are going to hit 21 exahash. Very important. Bitfarms' efficiency is 19 watts per terahash. That is really good, and it evidently represents a figure that was reached like 3 to 4 months ahead of schedule. Again, very, very positive. From a liquidity perspective, that's something I always like to look at, right? So it looks like as of the March 2025 update, there's about $132 million in total liquidity with about $39 million of that in cash. So I was eating dinner last night and I was just kind of playing on my calculator on my phone. And I said, hey, if there's about 550 million shares of Bitfarms out there and we take, I think at the time it was like roughly 135, maybe 136 million of liquidity that had been reported for March 26, 2025 as part of, I kind of forget what kind of update came out. But I sort of did some math, and it kind of came out to like about roughly here, 25 cents per share, right, of Bitfarms is actually like their liquid position. And I didn't necessarily finish my thought. I posted some of these numbers on X, just kind of like observing, hey, so you've got about 25 cents worth of liquidity, which is more or less the same, maybe a little bit less, maybe call it 23 cents, per share, based on today's numbers. But you've got about, say, 23 to 25 cents of liquidity per share. You've got the shares themselves, right, closing below, yesterday, I think it was like 79 cents or so, 78 cents a share. And I observed, that it was less than a year ago that Riot Platforms offered over $2 a share for the entire company, which at the time, I understand, like a lot of people thought, hey, man, that seems like a low number. And I didn't really have any sort of conclusive thought other than to observe, here we are in, like April 1st, 2025, the share price is around 80 cents a share, right? You've got, I think, a lot of operational things moving in the right direction, including the fact that, hey, Stronghold Digital Mining was finally fully acquired in the month of March. That's a really big deal. The Paraguay site was completely divested. And I know that was met with some pushback by some investors who felt, hey, wait, you've already put the time, effort, and energy and money into, building the site up to where you built it. Why give up? Why give that up? And I think Bitfarms would probably argue, hey, we sort of, by selling it, not only generated some meaningful, cash, but we also are now, avoiding having to spend, I think it was like upwards of $300+ million to deploy, Bitcoin mining machines to that site. So there's a CapEx savings as well. But again, when you think about the Riot offer in the context of where we're trading today, yeah, again, these are very complex issues. I don't necessarily have well-formulated thoughts. I'm kind of curious if you, at some level, think to yourself, man, would we, meaning Bitfarms, have been better off just kind of joining forces with Riot? I don't know if the Stronghold deal would have ever materialized had that occurred. So, we could play these looking in the rearview mirror games all day, right? I do think, though, that the lesson that perhaps we learn from this is, hey, if there were to be another offer from Riot sometime in 2026, hey, hopefully there's going to be a very thorough debate, and maybe not just a wholesale rejection of any offer, but maybe some conversation as to how do we potentially make a deal work, right? To just be really open-minded to that. Because as I've said before, I do think that the entire publicly traded Bitcoin mining ecosystem needs to be consolidated. There's just too many companies out there. I think it would be great if there were like a handful of them that could really operate at like massive scale, right? Hey, the regulatory requirements of being listed, it's going to pretty much be the same dollar amount, whether you are a combination of 5 Bitcoin mining companies or just one. So I think there's tremendous savings to be had there. So again, that's a bit in the distance, but it's something that I'm sort of thinking about. As it relates to CapEx, I mentioned how the Paraguay site being divested means that Bitfarms doesn't have to spend upwards of like 300 some odd million on Bitcoin mining machines for that site. Well, those are small numbers in comparison to what the potential expenditure might be to develop some sort of HPC AI business. And I have seen some comments that I think point out quite fairly, that, hey, it's like, the company is sort of going from what is already a fairly high CapEx intensive line of work, which is Bitcoin mining, and pivoting into something where potentially it seems like the CapEx is even greater. So, the question then becomes, okay, well, how much debt is going to be assumed to potentially create this new line of business? What would the revenue look like? Does it really generate a positive return on investment? I think from a purely mathematical perspective, one would have to believe, right, that both the board and management at Bitfarms are, clearly looking at these numbers and trying to figure out what makes the most sense, especially as it relates to what kind of deal you strike with a potential partner. But right now, I'm just observing everything from afar. I have yet to really dive into shares of Bitfarms, and I don't see myself doing that in the very near future. But I'm very, very keenly aware of what's going on with the share price. There is the specter of not immediate delisting. I've seen some people say, oh, we're going to be delisted in like whatever, 24, 25, 26 days, whatever the exact numerical value would be. It doesn't quite work that way. It's not like you automatically get delisted. You get a letter sent to you. You can apply for a grace period, or maybe it's automatically given. I kind of forget. Stronghold Digital Mining went through this whole process. It wasn't an immediate delisting. So, I'm optimistic that maybe we get some days here where the share price closes above $1 again. And I think if we see the price of Bitcoin, which today did quite well, relatively speaking, right? If we see more days like that, I do think that we could see Bitfarms, shares of Bitfarms, materially, participate in a rally. So, if you own shares of Bitfarms, right, hey, you got to make your own decision. But I would say that I do sense that there is going to be some sort of announcement regarding HPC AI, if that's even going to materialize. I think we're going to find out something about that sooner than later. And then the really big unknown is, okay, well, how much of an investment is it to get started in this new line of business? And, what kind of revenue can we expect? What's the balance sheet going to look like? Are you going to have $3 billion in debt and maybe have 15 years of revenue coming in to try to pay that off? Again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think that could be great for the company, for the business, right? But I don't know if it's really great for shareholders. What kind of growth can you potentially see if you've locked in your potential revenue for the next 15 years? Yes, you could see some spikes in Bitcoin, right? Hey, that could be where the revenue growth comes from. But, these are all things that really need to be fleshed out and kind of analyzed and kind of carefully reviewed. And we just don't have enough information to really, I think, speak intelligently about any of this, at least not yet. Okay, in summary, I thought that was a really decent March 2025 update. 19.5 exahash. That's great. That's really close to the goal of 21. Hey, an efficiency of 19 watts per terahash. I think that's phenomenal. And a liquidity position of about $132 million, of which almost 40 million of which is pure cash. Hey, I don't see this company as being ready to roll over based on those numbers. So, but that's not to say that the shares are, ready to burst into the air and kind of get finally back up to $2, $3, $4, $5, $6 plus dollars a share. That doesn't seem to be in the cards, at least not yet. Watch my comment just now have been sort of the contra indicator, right? The fact that I said, hey, I don't see that happening anytime soon. Hopefully, right now we'll see shares really start to move. I really do hope so, because there are some really, really long-suffering Bitfarms shareholders out there. And I know that feeling all too well. It could be very painful, very frustrating. Hey, I'm going to link in the description to today's broadcast the news release regarding, the March 2025 Bitfarms update. I'll also link to a broadcast that I aired not that long ago about how to deal with losses and anxiety in terms of the stock market, because again, we're dealing with a stock price that's pretty rough right now with Bitfarms, as with really all the publicly traded Bitcoin miners, which I am going to start talking more about. I promise. I'm doing a lot of work on the back end here. But also just the market as a whole hasn't really been doing that well. So some people might find that very interesting. Some coping strategies. This is an interview with a licensed psychologist, which I thought was phenomenal. And I think it could be very useful. So with all of that said, my friend, let's stay positive. Let's be great. And we'll see each other again very, very soon.